Good morning, Read 180 students. We are going to be working on lesson 11. Kind of hard to believe that we've had that many lessons in our real book so far with our third workshop. So anyway, if we look, today is Thursday, April 30th. We will be wrapping up part 3 of The Lottery by Shirley Jackson. And so this is a good time. If you are missing work, you're going to have to go back. Go into YouTube and find the slides and the slideshow, because that is where all the instruction is going to be for you. But for today, again, we're gonna wrap up working with literary elements, and the focus is going to be analyzing theme. Now, we talked about theme way at the beginning of the workshop, if you can remember. I know it was kind of a long ways away that we did that. But when you look at theme, when we looked at those literary elements, we talked about how theme is really kind of the message that the author, maybe kind of a lesson that the author wants us to learn. So one of the themes that we did talk about early on was that tradition, while many of us really enjoy traditions, I think of like birthday traditions or holiday traditions, things with your family and friends. Those are positive memories for us. But in this story, the tradition of the lottery caused people to do really terrible things. And sometimes when people conform like everyone else, they kind of go along with the tradition, but they might not really enjoy it. But yet they do it. And so we kind of learned a little bit about our characters and human nature, that, we use the word conformity early on, how we will conform to what's happening with the group. Like, again, I think of a tradition even in your own family. Now, there are some people who really love the tradition, like maybe your mom makes you wear an ugly sweater for family pictures, and you might not think that's the greatest tradition, but your mom does. And so you do it because it makes her happy. So again, in this particular story, though, people were doing terrible things, and we're going to read a little bit more about that today when we finish our third section, finishing up our last part 3. So again, today's learning target is going to be, I can figure out a story's theme and analyze text details that reflect the theme. And again, you'll be expected to go back into the text to find evidence to support answers that you come up with. Now, just like we've done the last few days, we're going to do our last academic vocabulary, and we'll do it together for page 148. And again, we're going to read, like I said, we're going to read the dramatic conclusion of this story, and then we're going to talk about the bigger message that the author has, Shirley Jackson has for us. So let's take a look at your 2 vocabulary words. Your first word is general. And general is an adjective or describing word of a noun. And if you look at the definition, the meaning, it is relating to a whole of something rather than part of it. So my example would be, the general atmosphere in class before students make presentations is one of excitement and nervousness. So I think about like when you did your science fair presentations, some of you were very excited to get up. In general, the general atmosphere was, you could tell that either kids were really excited or very nervous, but you guys acted differently and maybe didn't even realize it. Okay. Now the next word is force, and the definition or meaning of force, and force is a verb, it's an action word. It's to use power to move something. So my example would be, if a door sticks, you can try to force it open by pushing it hard. Okay, and again, you can stop this recording to fill in your meanings, and then you're also going to want to do the example. Okay, so if you look for the word general, what is the general feeling in your classroom on a Friday afternoon? And I want you to, so I think of like a typical Friday if you were in school right now, not distant learning. The general feeling in your classroom on a Friday afternoon is what? How are your classmates feeling and acting? And then for the word force, you're going to be asked to answer this question. What might happen if you try to force open a stuck window? So if you try to force open a stuck window, it might what? What'll happen? Okay, before we start reading the conclusion, I want you to look at the top of page 149 because when we get done, I'm going to ask you to complete the key idea. And it says, what happens at the conclusion or the end of the story? So there again, you're going to just summarize it in like one sentence. How did it end up? Okay, so let's go back to page 148 and you can follow along as I read it. You'll notice we only have one footnote and the word is beamed, which means to smile broadly or kind of big. Okay, all right, so page 148. The crowd was quiet. A girl whispered, "I hope it's not Nancy," and the sound of the whisper reached the edge of the crowd. "It's not the way it used to be," Old Man Warner said dearly. Clearly, sorry. "People ain't the way they used to be." "All right," Mr. Summers said. "Open the papers, Harry. Harry, you open little Dave's." Mr. Graves opened the slip of paper, and there was a general sigh, kind of like an overall sigh through the crowd, as he held it up, and everyone could see that it was blank. Nancy and Bill Jr. opened theirs at the same time, and both beamed, smiled brightly, and laughed, turning around to the crowd and holding their slips of paper above their heads. "Tessie," Mr. Summers said. There was a pause, and then Mr. Summers looked at Bill Hutchinson, and Bill unfolded his paper and showed it. It was blank. "It's Tessie," Mr. Summers said, and his voice was hushed. "Show us her paper, Bill." Okay, top of page 149. Bill Hutchinson went over to his wife and forced the slip of paper out of her hand. It had a black spot on it. The black spot Mr. Summers had made the night before with a heavy pencil in the coal company office. Bill Hutchinson held it up, and there was a stir in the crowd. "All right, folks," Mr. Summers said, "let's finish quickly." Although the villagers had forgotten the ritual and lost the original black box, they still remembered to use stones. The pile of stones the boys had made earlier was ready. There were stones on the ground with the blowing scraps of paper that came out of the box. Mrs. Delacroix selected a stone so large she had to pick it up with both hands and turned to Mrs. Dunbar. "Come on," she said, "hurry up." Mrs. Dunbar had small stones in both hands, and she said, gasping for breath, "I can't run at all. You'll have to go ahead, and I'll catch up with you." The children had stones already, and someone gave little Davy Hutchinson a few pebbles. Tessie Hutchinson was in the center of a cleared space by now, and she held her hands out desperately as the villagers moved in on her. "It isn't fair," she said. A stone hit her on the side of the head. Old Man Warner was saying, come on, everyone." Steve Adams was in the front of the crowd of villagers, and Mrs. Graves beside him. "It isn't fair, it isn't right," Mrs. Hutchinson screamed, and then they were upon her. Okay, now that brings us to the end of the lottery. So as we think about the theme, again, first of all, when if you look back maybe on some of the clues that we saw or that we read about, we kind of figured out by inferring that the lottery was not something that the people were excited for. In fact, they were very hesitant. They were nervous. You could tell they got excited, like yelling things like, "It isn't fair," because they knew the result was. Now, we didn't know, but if you think back earlier in the story when they talked about that, when the boys were collecting those stones, and we kind of talked about it, I wonder why they were doing that. It seemed kind of weird or kind of strange that they would run around and make a pile of these stones. So really, there was a clue early on, and we call that foreshadowing, which means then that there's something down the line in the plot or in the storyline where that's important. And of course, it happened where the lottery was, if you got the paper with the black dot on it, you ended up being in the middle of the crowd as people threw stones at her or at that person. So again, the larger message is from the author. Now, what I'm going to have you do is we're going to reread paragraph 77 to 81 on page 149, and then we're going to turn back to page 133 so we can fill out that theme section of the graphic organizer. Okay, so let's look at paragraph 77. Mrs. Dunbar had small stones in both hands, and she said, gasping for breath, "I can't run at all. You'll have to go ahead and I'll catch up with you." The children had stones already, and someone gave little Davy Hutchinson a few pebbles. Tessie Hutchinson was in the corner of a cleared space by now, and she held her hands out desperately as the villagers moved in on her. "It isn't fair," she said. A stone hit her on the side of the head. Old Man Werner was saying, come on, everyone." Steve Adams was in the front of the crowd of the villagers, with Mrs. Graves beside him. "It isn't fair, it isn't right," Mrs. Hutchinson screamed, and then they were upon her. Okay, so what I'd like you to do now is go back to page 133, and you'll notice at the very bottom, we haven't really filled that section in because we really didn't know the overall theme too early on in the story. Okay, so what I'm going to have you do is turn to the next page here, and you can copy it right from the bottom. But the text meaning of the theme of this story is that tradition can cause people to do terrible things. People conform to be like everyone else. People go along with traditions without thinking. And again, you can come back to this page to fill in that. And actually, we're going to be filling out the whole section. But just so you're clear about what that theme is, that again, just because it's done, just because a community does something, doesn't make it right. And even if people don't agree with it, they all went along with it. Even though they were friends with Tessie Hutchinson, they still participated in throwing those stones at the end because as a lottery winner, that's what they did. Okay. Now we're going to go back to page 149 because we're going to do the two questions on the right-hand side where it says analyze theme and do the stretch. Okay. So I want you to answer these two questions. Analyze theme. Which do the villagers seem to value more? Do you think tradition or human life? Now that's kind of a judgment that you have to make on your own. And again, in order to get full credit, you can make that judgment, but make sure you go back into the text and give me some text evidence. Some of you are really good about answering the question, but you're missing out on that text evidence piece, and that's one of our learning targets. So if you are only getting like 3 points on your paper, it's probably because you're missing some citing that text evidence. Okay, and then your last question on this page, it says, what do you think happens to Tessie? And again, we're going to ask you to use text evidence to explain why you think the way you do. Okay. Now, I gave you a little hint off to the side if you're really stuck, and you can go ahead and refer to that if you need it. But again, what does it mean? Like I said, when they were upon her, doesn't mean that they all like jumped on top of her. It means then that the villagers were stoning her. Okay. So again, what do you think happened to Tessie? You know, as the lottery winner, what was her kind of her fate in this? Now, as you finish pages 148 and 149, and you'll submit that to Google Classroom, but we're going to look at this last slide. And these are also the 2 pages you'll be submitting for your final assignment. Now, I just went ahead and put in on page 133 in case you're stuck, because again, we're not doing this together in the classroom, so I want to make sure you understand that. You're go ahead looking at part 3. So now we know that the setting is still summer. It's just before noon, so we know they've been doing this for about 2 hours, and we know it's still the same day, and they're in that cleared area in the village square. Now your character analyzing says, how does Old Man Warner support the idea of tradition? Well, if you look at that, it says Old Man Warner really believes that there's always been a lottery. And he thinks that they're crazy fools if they don't agree with that. Remember, some of the younger townsfolk, some of the younger villagers are actually talking about discontinuing in the lottery, and he thinks they're crazy. So we know that Old Man Warner, even though he's been around probably the longest, he still supports that that tradition, even if a lot of people don't agree with it. And then the last thing we're going to fill in is the plot. And so what happens at the end of the story? And so again, you can, put down what you feel is important, and then if you're stuck, you can go ahead and look on page 1, looking at this slide, and fill in your book. Okay, because I think it's more important that you actually understand the beginning, middle, and end of this story. Okay. Now, I would like you to also take a before you take a picture, I'm going to have you go back to page 132, and this is what you will complete on your own. So as we read this and we've talked about it, we just didn't do this page, but this is kind of my way to see if you can distinguish between the setting, the characters, the plot, and the theme. So of those, you'll see there's 12 literary elements. I would like you to put them in the correct column. And once you're done with that, like I said, take a picture and submit to Google Classroom. Now, if I know, just a reminder, we do not have school Friday, May 1st, and we don't have school Monday, May 4th. Now, just if you guys have been keeping up with your reading, keeping up with your software and your Google Classroom assignments, this is a couple days of freedom for you guys. Now, we won't be assigning anything new, but if you are a student who hasn't been keeping up with the assignments and you're missing lots of things in Google Classroom and you haven't submitted anything via email to me, please take this time to get caught up. If you were a student who ended up getting a midterm report from me, that would be an indicator. Please get your work done. We are going to be moving forward, wrapping up workshop 3, and then we are going to be starting The Giver. And there again, we're going to move pretty fast through the novel to get through it before the end of the year. So please, please, please take your time to get your work done. Also, your reading logs are due and your bell work is due. So you got a few things that have to be turned in either by the end of the day, Thursday, or by May 1st, which is Friday. All right, take care, you guys. You guys are doing a good job. Really proud of you.